Hey nerds. So I wanted to talk about this book I read yesterday, Noam Chomsky book called Chomsky on Anarchism, which is a compilation of his writing in other books on specifically anarchism. And I wanted to really just talk about this part. This part is from his book called Objectivity and Liberal Scholarship, and it's a quote in which he's talking about intellectuals and basically gives an anarchist criticism of Marxism. So basically, he starts off by saying that intellectuals are elitists, which I think is totally true a lot of the time. And the way he puts it is, I think, is really good here. That intellectuals in interpreting history or formulating policy will tend to adopt an elitist position, condemning popular movements and mass participation in decision making, and emphasizing rather the necessity for supervision by those who possess the knowledge and understanding that is required, so they claim, to manage society and control social change. This is hardly a novel thought. One major element in the anarchist critique of Marxism a century ago was the prediction that, as Bakunin formulated it. So, first, I should explain. So, Bakunin, I've mentioned him before on previous videos, and I've gone into some of his writings. He was an anarchist. And remember, I've talked about other anarchists. So, other than Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman, for example, they were basically disillusioned socialist anarchists. Rather, they were totally against the state, but also totally against corporations, which is actually what anarchism is. What I find really fascinating about that is that these so-called anarcho-capitalists like Dave Smith and anarchists like Michael Malice, they act like anarchism is basically almost the same thing as anarcho-capitalism, but obviously anarcho-capitalism is just as dumb as communism because it praises the market and demonizes the state just as much as communism uh like reveres the state and hates the free market, basically. But basically, also, uh, Chomsky is an anarcho syndicalist, which is kind of more like what Bakunin and Kropotkin were. And oh, yeah, I forgot to mention Emma Goldman was also like a violent feminist anarchist. So she was one of those. I don't remember whether Bakunin or Kropotkin was. I think one of them was and one of them wasn't. But she was one of those anarchists who literally advocated for political violence. And a lot of these anarchists like Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman, they were like specifically disillusioned Russian socialists. So anyway, I'd say that anarcho syndicalism, the way it's described, is it's also sometimes labeled as libertarian socialism because it has kind of aspects of both. So it's basically kind of anarchism, but the idea that people should still gather in mass movements and there should be like committees of people in charge of things. And the part of it is this idea of the employees in a company also having say in what happens within the company, and some of them can be on the board for the company and that sort of thing. Like worker co-ops is a lot of the sort of thing that's mentioned. And like, to me, this is a really interesting political philosophy, and I think it sounds the best to me in theory, but obviously in practice I don't even know how practical that is for the real world. But anyway, anarcho-syndicalists like Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman, they're also sometimes labeled as anarcho-communists because they basically like, which is strange, and I think a mislabel because there's nothing communist about them, but they want anarchism, and then they want some sort of anarchism, with some of them basically turns into some sort of government, like with Peter Gelderloos, for example. I was doing a video in which he advocates for an anarchism with social programs and like a social safety net and shit like that, which is basically a government. And he's almost talking about voting, and he talks about voting for decisions like democracy. But anyway, I'd call Chomsky, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman, all anarcho-syndicalists of maybe slightly different persuasions. Anyway, so this is a good quote by Bakunin that Chomsky mentions. And I forgot to mention, I called this video, Chomsky says Marxism is a cult, because he doesn't mention this in this particular book or in this particular part of this book, but he has said before in another book that Marxism is a cult. Anyway, this is anarchist Bakunin's brilliant criticism of Marxism, I think. According to the theory of Mr. Marx, the people not only must not destroy the state, but must strengthen it and place it at the complete disposal of their benefactors, guardians, and teachers, the leaders of the Communist Party. So namely Mr. Marx and his friends, who will proceed to liberate mankind in their own way. So they basically, part of that is talking about the intellectual elites who are all elitists, like let's say Trotsky and Lenin, for example, like big, like actual communists and big advocates of Marx. And then I know Lenin and Trotsky were different, and they were more violent than Marx was, and communism is not the same for Marxism and all that. But the point remains that these intellectual elites and politicians he describes them as benefactors, guardians, and teachers. So they're basically intellectual and political elites who are ruling over society in an authoritarian way, and then it's a cult because it's based all on this figure Marx and his ideology, with Engels and the Communist Manifesto. And of course, Capital Volume 1 through 3 are their more relevant political works and economic works too. Anyway, Mr. Marx and his friends, so leaders of the Communist Party, namely Mr. Marx and his friends, who will proceed to liberate mankind in their own way. They will concentrate the reins of government in a strong hand, because the ignorant people, the ignorant masses, like remember the conservative political philosopher Leo Strauss I mentioned before, the vulgar masses and the ignorant masses. Anyway, they will concentrate the reins of government in a strong hand, because the ignorant people require an exceedingly firm guardianship. Yeah, the intellectual and political elites need to manage the people and control them. They will establish a single state bank, with, of course, government control of the means of production, which is literally the definition of communism. Anyway, concentrating in its hand, the single state bank will concentrate in its hands all commercial, industrial, cultural, and even scientific production. So, authoritarian state rule over industry, agriculture, and science. And then the communist state will divide the masses into two armies, industrial and agricultural. So, Marx, of course, talks about the Industrial Revolution and difference between the Industrial Revolution and farmers in terms of the way history has changed. And this is one of the ways in which Marx actually talks about the benefits of capitalism, because capitalism is preferable to feudalism. But anyway, obviously in communist countries and in communist like rulers, like especially Stalin, for example, were notorious for like destroying crops and causing mass famines, of course, as many people know, and Mao obviously was even worse. So anyway, they'll divide the masses into two armies, industrial and agricultural, under the direct command of the state engineers, the intellectual and political elite state engineers, who will constitute a new privileged scientific political estate. I like that. Scientific political state and regime of authoritarian communism. I can't help think that right-wing philosophy can be just as authoritarian, but obviously Chomsky points out Bakunin brilliantly skewering the fundamental flaw of Marxism.